Hello, and welcome to today's lecture. We will be discussing Renaissance and Reformation Renaissance art. More specifically, if you recall, we left off with Renaissance music after having traveled from the beginning of the Christian era up through the 1400s. And when we left that, we visited some of the four pockets of the Renaissance happenings in Italy, Florence, Rome, Venice, and up in the north in the Ghent area. Today we're going to be looking at some of the artists that were active in that time and reviewing some of what they did. You may recall looking at this picture. This is the Masaccio expulsion from the garden. And we studied it in terms of the garden and depictions of the Garden of Eden and the banishment, but also in terms of the directional lighting. You can see where the lighting source is supposed to be on, as from the light on their legs. We also looked at briefly this one, which is Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel, that creation of Adam. It's a fresco painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo is one of those guys that represents for us the the Renaissance. Also, the migration, we talked a little bit about the Medici family in Florence and how they had Michelangelo as part of their passel of people. Michelangelo gravitated down to Rome and did this painting on the top of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is a side room set off of the St. Peter's Basilica, which is in the Vatican. It's really a beautiful setting. All of the walls are fresco painted. This one is one of several parts of the ceiling that are painted. Now there were several doors put in on this, and this is the Ghiberti East doors. Ghiberti is the guy that put these together. There was a competition that was commissioned. Brunelleschi, if you recall, did the chapel in Florence, the dome, and there was a competition put in to make these doors for the Sistine Chapel. And it is perspective and relief. Let's go on to that last one. You can see that the artwork in there is, wrong thing. It's brass that's been, a copper that's been put onto wood block and then pressed down so that the symbols are pointed out. You may have done that in some crafts thing when you were younger. That is the East doors. Now let's go on to the chapel, the Florence Cathedral, because that's one of the pockets of the Renaissance and where art happened. This is Donatello's The Prophet. Donatello, the sculptor, not the turtle. Donatello was from around 1386 or so to 1466. He studied in Rome. He studied the classic statues, and this is one of those outpourings of that, results of that. This is the Prophet again. It's in the Florence Cathedral, and it's in the upper part. It's about 55 feet off of the ground, and he's facing a little bit down so that when somebody looks up at him, he can see the face looking down. You also notice that some of the stuff is kind of stark. The draping on his clothing is cut deep. His expression is pretty intense. That's so that you can see that expression from the distance. From you're standing on the ground 55 feet below him, you can actually see some of that stuff. You see here a picture of the chapel, the Donatello chapel coming up. Just adjusting here a little bit. He also did this picture of David. This is Donatello's David. around 1460. This is considered to be the first life-size bronze statue in the nude since antiquity. So recall that some of the Greek statues we looked at, in the Greek ideal, the human body was perfection, and so it was to be upheld. And then we got into the Christian era, and everybody was clothed. Modesty was the way to go. And then when the Greek thought come back in, and we start seeing the Greek influence as from the Neoplatonic school that the Medici family started. From our last lecture, the Neoplatonic school gave us this idea of the Greek ideal of the human body, and of course, the result of that for Donatello is that he does this body in the nude. And you can see, if you recall from the video we watched in our last lecture, that he's got his knee kind of bent, he's kind of off to one side. That reflects the Dorophorus and her contrappesto, the style of ancient Rome, and what they brought in with this relaxed, not straight, but kind of an S curve way of being. You can see also that he's wearing a Tuscan hat. That's not something that they would have worn in biblical times. The Tuscan hat is really representative of the area from which Donatello was working, and so it kind of gives that air of being situated in a particular space. This is the Verrocchio. Now, Verrocchio was from 1435 to 1488, 1435 in Florence, in 1488 in Venice. This is his David. It's about 4 feet tall. And I saw an example of this when I was in Israel at the King David's museum. Just standing out there, I said, I recognize that. How fun is that? He is, of course, clothed as opposed to nude, and he stares at the audience. Some experts would say that this represents a physical action. We go back to we look at the two side by side, and we see Donatello's contemplative eyes of David looking away, and compare that with Verrocchio's David, who's looking straight at you. That's one of the ways to tell the two. Donatello, don't look up. Verrocchio, veritas. All right, another artist really from the time. Those were sculptures that were gone. Uccello, this is his Battle of San Romano. Uccello is from about 1397 to 1475, again working in Florence. And what he gives to us, you can see the spears at the bottom, kind of lined up, pointing toward the back. That's one of the first attempts at really putting perspective into a painting. You don't see much else beyond that. There's not much else that would represent perspective, but you do see those things kind of lining up. This is a bloodless battle. They're infighting, they're spearing each other, but you don't see any blood. So it fits. A lot of color, a lot of pageantry. That's part of the late Gothic era. We're going to move into classical realism. After the pendulum swinging, and you can see that while he's got those spears on the floor and they kind of point toward a vanishing point in the back, he doesn't quite get that two-dimensional perspective idea yet. We see that really when we see Da Vinci's Last Supper. He's from 1452 in Italy, and he died in 1519 in France. This was painted in 1498 in Milan, which is northwest of Florence. It's on the Santa Maria delle Grazie wall. It's a fresco on a wall. And you can see that it is the epitome of perspective. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's go back to the idea that it's a fresco. Usually what they did when they were doing frescoes was that they put pigment in with the plaster so that the actual plaster was colored. That's what happened on the Sistine Chapel. It's actually the plaster that's been pigmented with color. What Da Vinci did here is that he experimented with putting tempera on the sealed plaster. So he plastered the wall and then had it sealed, and then he painted with tempera on the wall. New technique in doing a fresco, but the fresco all the same. So you can see the top, the ceiling tiles have this angular perspective to them, and in the wall you see on either side the hangings on the wall, not quite windows, but the hangings kind of point. And if you look, just look around it a little bit, you can see, and if you were to line up something on those things, you would line up and they would all converge, all would come together right at the forehead of Christ. So this is the ideal, this is the epitome of perspective coming into play now, so that the forward part looks bigger, it appears to be closer to you, and then through the use of perspective you have this vanishing point. So what they have is this vanishing point, which is on the horizon. You probably did this when you were in grade school, where you draw a line and you put a dot there, and then your buildings that you build on the street, they all kind of angle toward that dot. That's the vanishing point, and this is one of the first examples of that, the earliest examples. Da Vinci was a master at that. Now Michelangelo, who of course was in Florence for the Medici family and then did the Sistine Wall, he also did the statue of David. Michelangelo is from 1475-ish to 1564 in Rome. We've talked about the Sistine Chapel and the creation of man, and he was in Florence. This is probably his most famous work. It is the human form in perfection. Again, you see the contrapposto style of the legs and the off-centered body kind of standing there, very reflective of the Donatello David. It's just bigger. It's huge. This is an example of the Pietà, which is Mary holding the crucified Christ. This is a statue that's built out of a stone that was a triangle, kind of a pyramid, and it still retains some of that pyramidic form with a wider base. She's holding the adult Jesus after the crucifixion. Her head, the head of Mary, is the apex or the high point. The drapes provide and cover the base of the statue. Now that's all happening down in Rome. That's one of the pockets of the Renaissance art. In the north, up where the Flemish school is happening, is where we have the Flemish school in Ghent. Ghent is one of the main towns, the Merode area. We saw earlier the Bosch piece a couple of weeks ago. This is the Kampen Merode altarpiece. This is called Merode. It's the Annunciation in the middle pedal. Now, the Annunciation is when the angel comes to Mary and tells her that she's going to have a baby. And it's a supernatural event, the Annunciation, in a contemporary setting. You look at this and you say, well, that looks like the 1400s. That does not look like somewhere in Bethlehem in the time of Jesus. Well, that's right. This is a contemporary setting of a biblical story. And you can see the lilies that represent Mary's purity. The rose bush, which is representative of the Sacred Virgin. She's likely reading from Isaiah, where the passage says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive." And then there's the water and the towel, which represent the idea of the baptism. You also see the axe and the rod on the right side, and the saw representing Isaiah 10:15. So there's a lot of symbolism in this. This is the Merode altarpiece. Again, this is a triptych. Triptych, T-R-I, for 3, thick panels. And you can see that the middle section where she is having her Annunciation is bigger than the 2 sides. This would be on the altar, and the 2 sides would fold in a little bit so that it would stand upright. At about the same time, the Van Eycks were operating in Belgium, and they did this Ghent altarpiece. Now, this also is a triptych, although there's more folds than that. You can see that on in the middle picture on the bottom, you have the action taking place, and then that's framed with a hinge, and that hinge goes all the way up to the top. That's where the first fold would be. This is the Adoration of the Lamb, done in 1432. It's done in Ghent, Belgium, and it's not just a triptych, it's a polytych, because where each of those pictures end, there's a fold. You can fold it several times, not just the original 3 times. This has symbolism that you can look in your text in chapter 11 to read about some of that. This is up in the north. This is, so we've looked at Florence briefly, where the Medici family was doing some of their things, and then some of that moved down to Rome. We went up now to the Flemish school and the Renaissance up there. And then finally, we have the Venetian school. So the 4 pockets of Renaissance taking place there as well. This is the Titian Bacchus and Ariadne. Titian was an artist in Venice who dabbled in a new style, oil on canvas. He used extensive use of oil because of the area being too wet. If you recall from geographic studies, Venice is the city that's built on rivers and has a lot of moisture in it, so it's too wet for frescoes and murals and tempera and all the other things. So this is really the first time that we see oil painting on canvas from this. This is around 1520, so we're in the 16th century now. If you look closely, there's 2 people that are wearing gowns. One on the far left with the red sash. She's got on a blue, there's a blue gown there, and then almost right in the middle, the gal has on a blue dress. This particular blue is called the Venetian blue, and it is a result of the use of the oil on canvas, the oils that they were using. In fact, all of these, if you compare them to some of the other paintings that we've seen, the Venetian school is a whole lot brighter, and it really gives a vivid coloring to the paintings to be using the oil. Finally, Tintoretto, also in the same area, the Venetian school, is using tempera. Remember that Da Vinci used tempera on plaster for the Last Supper. Tintoretto used tempera on wood for this picture of the Last Supper, which is done in 1593, 1594, toward the end of the 16th century. You can see that you've got the head of Christ as the main light source, right in the middle of the picture, and then the other light sources up to the left of that, where the lamp is. Those are the two sources of light in this picture, and you have some great perspective going on with the table and some of the table on the right side with the guy and the fruit. And then, of course, up in the smoke of the lamp is where you see the angels floating around. This is Tintoretto's portrayal of the Last Supper, dramatically different than that of Da Vinci in the chapel in Milan. So that's just some of the artwork from the Renaissance time period. Pretty much all of that is featured in some of the quizzes that we take, and it's fun stuff. There's a lot of things that are happening during the Renaissance time that change the way that art is done and change the way that we look at how art is done. Have a great day.